Thank you, Professor Loury, for a fascinating, powerfully argued, passionate talk. So we have plenty of time for question and answers. We will use the mic for that because this is being recorded. Please try to keep your questions brief, and we'll go ahead and get started.
Thank you for your lecture. My question is about, you said that affirmative action was treating symptoms and not curing disease, but then you also said that human development is all about social capital and the connections that you make, including like parental and your family. So doesn't affirmative action help build that social capital, especially like generationally in the long run?
Okay, I mean, that's a hypothesis. We could examine it. Let me ask a question in return, or it's a rhetorical question. I don't expect you to give an answer. What kind of social capital across racial lines is being built on American university campuses today where affirmative action is practiced? Are groups intermarrying, interdating, creating cross-racial lines conflicts, cross-class conflicts, contacts, cross-class contacts? Are they thickening the web of social connection? Or are they dispersing themselves and finding their own territory and separating and maintaining and reproducing the very divisions that they might have been experiencing prior thereto? Is the university an engine for the creation of social capital across racial lines is what I'm asking. Are those students at Duke who decided not to do chemistry or not to do biology or physics, but to do English or to do sociology or to do history, are they ending up with more social capital at the end of the day? I frankly don't know. I'm not saying they are. I'm not saying they aren't. I'm saying that's the question that we might want to ask. If you're saying, as Bowen and Bach said, and they did say this in their book, originally published 1998, The Shape of the River, a defense of practicing affirmative action at elite places like Princeton, where Bowen was president, or Harvard, where Bach was president, they say, look, our young people come in here of color. Yes, there's preferential admissions, but they go out into the community, and our alumni are very influential, and they have a beneficial spillover for social benefit because they are equipped with the skills and the connections and the kind of intellectual resources that we have to impart, and we think we're doing something good for society in doing that. I would count that on the plus side of the ledger. I would definitely say that's not bad, that's good. I don't know if Michelle Obama was admitted to Princeton under some program of affirmative action. I'm not saying that she was. I'm not saying she wasn't. But if she was, okay, that's okay with me. The net result of that would appear to be a benefit to society. A person could make that argument. I could see making that argument. But I want to maintain, and again, I invite you to look at the data, look at the SAT test data and so forth. And so on. The disparities here are really, really very substantial. And while it's not necessarily the burden of an elite institution to take on the societal challenge of addressing those disparities, I claim two things. It is the burden of society to take it on, and secondly, when the university tries to circumvent or sidestep the implications of those disparities, it creates a situation in which there is not equal dignity and respect. I don't know if you don't agree with that. I'm not sure that anything I say is going to persuade you of it, but that's my concern.
Yeah, I was curious if we're talking, so speaking of equality of opportunity, where would you draw that opportunity line? So say when it comes to the Latin school in Chicago, which is a K through 12 program that costs, I don't know, $30,000, $40,000 a year to go to, and obviously has teachers that make $150,000 a year or so. Versus, say, a pre-K through 12 school on the south side of Chicago. I think you get what I'm saying. Where does the equality of opportunity start? Basically, is what I'm asking.
Let me tell you what I think you're saying. I think you're saying that people from birth have circumstances that differ in terms of the opportunity afforded to those people for their development. How far back do we want to go if we're seeking to equalize opportunity?
Essentially, like, isn't wealth self-perpetuating and poverty, in a sense, self-perpetuating? At least the weight of it is self-perpetuating.
Well, there should be more interclass mobility than there is. Self-perpetuating? No, I wouldn't say that. I'm actually drawing on the observation that the separation of social networks within racially defined populations and the differences across families and the resources that are being brought to bear affect the development of their children. And I am, I'm not a libertarian opponent of every effort to try to increase the opportunities available to disadvantaged kids through social policy of one kind or another. That's not the position that I'm taking. But I think that at the end of the day, once we have prudently extended the social safety net to ensure that everybody has access to some kind of education, that people have enough to eat and that they have shelter, that health care is available to people who need health care regardless of their means to pay, and so on, that people have can be afforded security and safety of person and property in the places where they live and where they work and do business, there are still going to be disparities. So I'm not sure I'm addressing your question. Those disparities we're going to have to live with to some degree, and the developmental differences between people are, to some degree, a fact of social life. That you say wealth is predetermined. I don't think so. I don't think so at all.
My question's a little beyond the scope of your paper, but I think you'll see how it's related. It's really about the last part, your outline of the logic, the destructive logic of group identitarianism, which I agree with. That said, however, as the phrase "cover your ass" suggests, you could argue that the heads of elite institutions are not leading a charge, they're responding to social changes that are not only post-civil rights legislation, but the reality is that intermarriage rates in America have increased consistently for a couple of generations across races, across ethnic groups, et cetera. But at the same time, it seems to me an absolute social fact that in our society, there's more about groups. We don't just see it in universities in the cafeteria, we see it in music, many aspects of culture. What do you make of that? That at the same time, when there's more of a permeable membrane in society, we look a lot like Eastern Europe a century ago.
So a recent conversation I was having with somebody at my podcast, and thank you, David, for there you are, for mentioning my podcast. We got to talking about, suppose we had sliced into American society in, 1910, and we had some Irish, and we had some Italian, and we had some Slavs, we had some Jews, and we had some Polish, and we had, and they were groups. They had their own languages, they had their food, their customs, their habits, they had their social networks, and so forth and so on. They had their identities. By the time you get to 2010, a century on, there are people of Irish descent and of Italian descent and maybe Jewishness is an exception. We are in a Hillel house here. To the general point that I'm making, but a certain kind of softening of boundary and a certain kind of intermingling and breaking down had transpired and has transpired. A lot of intermarriage. They're wearing it much more lightly. They're wearing the cloak of identity much more likely. They can take it off. Would that we would achieve by the year 2110 such a social circumstance with respect to what we're calling race? I don't know that it's impossible. I know we're going in the wrong direction right now. Yeah, I mean, there's a guy called Rogers Brubaker. He's a sociologist at UCLA. He has a book called Ethnicity Without Groups. I highly commend it. It's a collection of essays. He's a brilliant theorist. And in it, he says, what is groupness? He says, groupness is made, and how is it made? It's made by operators. It's made by entrepreneurs. It's made by political demagogues. It's made by media moguls. There are forces in society that draw us or repel us away from this thing. And that's the thing, says Brubaker, to be studied, the dynamics of the making and the remaking of groupness. And I think we see it playing out in our time. I mean, a person could have said, in response to concerns about racial violence, police killing unarmed citizens who were black, a person could have said correctly, there are twice as many whites as blacks in any given year who are killed by police officers. And it could have said, of course, statistically, there's still a relatively higher rate for blacks, but the absolute number of people killed by police, and could have said, the problem here is not a problem of race. Derek Chauvin, the white cop in Minneapolis who kneeled on George Floyd's neck, was his whiteness even relevant to what it is that we're talking about? Or is that something that we are bringing to the situation? That once that ball gets going, once that narrative gets underway, it becomes irresistible. It's a site for people to make careers. It's a site for people to stir the pot, but it's not the only way of looking at it. We have a choice about how we narrate our travails here in the United States of America, and I hold out the prospect that a de-emphasis on racial identity and an emphasis on the class differences between populations and on the common humanity of all people still will have its say. I mean, I'm an optimist about that. Certainly, if I have anything to say about it, that's what I'm going to push for.
Thank you for your lecture. My question is, what channel should be used to reprioritize societal values that aim to uphold and advance human distinction across racial groups?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question. What values?
What channels
Oh,
should be used to reprioritize social values to uphold, human distinction?
reprioritize social values. Okay, so I think about media, I think about popular entertainment and so forth. I think about the university and how it is that we approach our charge here to teach our students. I don't know. I mean, my honest answer to you is I'm not sure how to change the conversation. I'm just one contributor to the conversation. I'm calling it the way I see it, but I'm not sure what to do about it.
So from what I've learned, students who are accepted to top universities and thus by your logic deemed worthy, who choose to go to lower ranked universities, they most usually end up at the same social status or income as they would have had at the higher university. But there's one exception to this from what I've learned in class and stuff, that's economically disadvantaged individuals. I'm told that when they go to top schools like Harvard, Princeton, Brown, they end up better off than their previous trajectory. So by this logic, wouldn't affirmative action help economically disadvantaged people of color?
Well, you added the of color at the end, but the finding wasn't it for disadvantaged people broadly? Let me restate what I understand to be the claim. The claim is a kid goes to a state school or a kid goes to an elite school. How much difference does it make? For most kids, no difference at all, but for there are some kids it makes a big difference, and those are economically disadvantaged kids. Am I stating the fact correctly?
No, it's kids who, for example, get accepted into Harvard, but they choose to go to a Penn State. So for those kids, like people who are economically disadvantaged who go to Harvard, they end up at a higher social status and income. But people who choose to go to Harvard versus people who choose to go to Penn State but got accepted into Harvard, those two people will have the same social status and
That's
income.
interesting. Okay, so everybody's been admitted to Harvard in this study. Some go, some don't go. Of those who don't go, some do worse by not going, others don't do worse by not going.
I think like most, if not all, end up at the same social status.
But kids from economically disadvantaged families lose by not going to Harvard.
Yes.
Okay. Well, that's news to me. I'm interested. I would want to look for that. And you're asking, doesn't that justify Harvard's having a preferential admissions policy for disadvantaged students?
Wouldn't that help people who are economically disadvantaged raise to higher heights than their current trajectory would allow them to go?
It's an argument in that direction, sure. And economic disadvantage wasn't part of my brief here. I didn't address myself to whether you should have preferential admissions or give points or take into account to the applicants' benefit the fact that they come from an economically disadvantaged group. I mean, you will know that not all students of color at a university are disadvantaged economically. Those are two very, very different things. So that's what I would say. But I wasn't aware of the study, and I'll look for it.
Hello. So I actually have had this question since the year 2020. I couldn't formulate it until now after you spoke. But I was wondering what your opinion is on cancel culture, and why exactly do we create cancel culture? Why do we follow it? More specifically, why is it so difficult for people to talk about this stuff without being considered racist? And I feel like a lot of institutions and places have made decisions based off of this concept as well, because they don't want to be considered like racist or like looked down upon because they're not admitting a certain number of, people of color or people from different social statuses. So that's kind of my question. I'm kind of formulating it as well as I go.
You've been thinking about that for a couple of years.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I have a paper that I commend to your attention. It's eminently readable. There are no equations or graphs in it. It's called Self-Censorship and Public Discourse, A Theory of Political Correctness, published in 1994, and Rationality and Society, the journal. You can find it. You can just go like that and find it. And in this paper, I develop an argument about why we end up in what an economist would call a bad equilibrium. See, the thing is, it's very easy to see what people say. It's harder to know what they really believe. Mm-hmm. So if I don't want to be thought of as a person who, let's say, is a racist, then if I'm heard saying the kind of things that we all know only racists say, my reputation will take a hit. I'll be thought of in bad, I'll be put in bad odor by the fact that people think that I'm a racist because I've said something that someone who is known to be a racist said. We know that people on the wrong side of history are against affirmative action. They're against reparations. They don't think discrimination is a problem. They don't like Ibram X. Kendi. We know that, okay? We know that those people exist. I don't want to be associated with those people because while I may not particularly care for Professor Kendi, I may or I may not, I'm not a racist like those people. So I suppress my, thing. And then that can snowball into a thing where no one is willing to say what they really think, and where the only kinds of things that can be said about the subject are platitudes. There are only certain approved things that you can say. That can be an equilibrium. It's an emperor has no clothes type situation often, where a lot of people think something is amiss, but nobody wants to be the first person to say it, and since no one is saying it, other people who think it don't know that they're not alone in thinking it, and so that can be a bad. So that's my very simple gloss on what happens when you get to political correctness. But we're in a university. The end of universities. We're in a university. We can't do what we're here to do and have that kind of thing going on at the same time because it kills deliberation and rational thought and argument. We have to have it so that it's safe to take the other side of an argument, the unpopular side of an argument, because the popular side might be wrong. We're supposed to be after truth. So I understand political correctness, or what you're calling cancel culture, as a general social phenomenon. I understand it as a general social phenomenon. But you create institutions with leaders who have control over what they do in order precisely to get out of the box that kind of thing can lead you into. So I'm doing what I can to, make arguments, regardless of how popular people might. Thank you.
I want to get back to this elite idea. I'm not quite sure. I don't think that Harvard, they might have got here first, and they made the most money of anybody because they were here first, and they built it on the backs of slaves and rum and the working man in America. And for some reason or other, we have them on this pedestal. And for all the good someone thinks they might have done, there's a lot of things that these so-called smart people have taken us down the wrong road. So here they are now in 2022. Now they're just a big real estate development operation disguised as a educational institution, and keep pumping out these, just across the river with the other ones. But the thing is that it's a bit of a mirage to the whole thing that we strive towards. I mean, who decided that they had the right path? They're a group, and they've maintained their groupness for a long time. It's breaking down a little bit now because of court cases and things like that. But there's still that clique that got here first. They want to keep it the way they built it, and they let Derek Bach himself, not a pretty good fella, but I just think that it's a big mistake for us to use them and the rest of the Ivy Leaguers, because I don't think they deserve that kind of honor that we should all be striving to be them. I think there's other places we can go to for universities and educational institutions to look to for the right way to go to have better people and a better country.
Thanks for the comment. That was not a question. It is quite all right. What we would say back where I came up, I feel you, bro. That's the reason that Donald J. Trump has had the impact on American culture that he has, because he understands that point. That's not an advertisement for Trump. It's just an observation that a lot of people have had it up to here with elites who have, at one turn or another, not been very clever about what they're doing. But I teach at Brown, man.
Other questions?
Thanks for your talk. My question is about the distinction you made between remedial intervention in a time of crisis versus a kind of non-crisis time, or when you're saying that your objection to affirmative action didn't go all the way down because there might be a certain context, but your read was, we're not in that context anymore. And I guess my question is, it would apply to affirmative action, but not only that, or not just that, but just kind of in general, how would we know, or how do you think the best way to think about what qualifies as a time of crisis versus what isn't, or what's definitive of the crisis time versus the non-crisis time, and then how would we think in principled ways about whether we're in it or not? Because I could imagine if we're just sort of thinking of our judgment calls or something, someone might hear what you say and say, yeah, but this is a time of crisis, or something like that. So if we're not just to kind of have competing judgment calls, it seems like we need to know, well, what's sort of definitive of that, and how do we say when we're in it or out of it? And so how do you think about that question?
Okay, that's fair, because we did have the summer of 2020 in terms of racial disturbance and protests that were not always peaceful and all that. We do have a simmering kind of thing that we're sitting on here at the tinderbox. You don't know what's going to happen next if, some altercation in a city somewhere becomes a viral incident that ends up fueling a certain kind of uprising. So you could say that crisis in terms of race relations and such is not over. I would say it ain't 1970 anymore. I was there. I'm an old guy. I was around in the 60s. I remember what happened in the long, hot summers, 65, 66, 67, 68. I remember And we're just a completely different country. I mean, first of all, the immigration liberalization of the 1965 statute, I don't remember what it was called offhand, opened up the doors for influx into the American population of what has now come to be tens of millions of people from non-European ports of call. They're not white people. They are here, and they are Americans, and their children are here, and they're Americans, and the landscape is very different. It's ironic beyond belief that it's an Asian group that's in court suing on behalf of eliminating affirmative action. This is the 21st century. This is not the 20th century anymore. It's not just a black and a white country anymore. Secondly, we've had nearly three generations here to institutionally adapt to the historical exclusion of African Americans. We're so far from Jim Crow, it's not even funny. I mean, it amuses me that people, like at my campus, run around with banners saying it's a racist institution. It's as far from a racist institution, on my reading, as you could possibly be. Do they know who the president is? Do they know who the provost is? Do they know who the dean of students are? Do they know what the faculty of the English department is saying? Do they know what's going on in the history department? These are not racist institutions. So the predicate is different. Whereas if you showed up a black kid on a white elite college campus in 1970, I mean, it was a lonely thing. You couldn't get invited to the eating club. You were shunned. You had microaggressions up the wazoo. There was everywhere you turned, you were being reminded that you were an outsider. That's not the circumstance that we face anymore. So my answer to you is timing. 50 years is a long time. 50 years, it's practically as long as from Appomattox to Versailles. The whole world is different since the height of the civil rights movement. This is an anachronism, this special treatment of people by race in order to get the optics right, is not, and in my unguarded moments, I'm saying that, the world is changing. There's competition, there's globalization, the Chinese are coming. So we had better get with it. We had better get with developing our people and not playing shell games. That's my answer to you.
I'll exercise a moderator's privilege and follow up on that question. So what if someone were to come back to say, look, let's take 1619 to 1969, 350 years. Why think that 50 years is the right time horizon rather than another 350 years? I'm not saying
come on, Nicole Hannah-Jones. I mean, the country wasn't founded in 1619.
But the force of that objection has to do with time horizons. Put aside that date. It's not just this objection says it's not just Jim Crow and that the thing ends and then we measure from there. No, we need to look back. What would you say to someone raising that kind of objection?
I'd say the reason you're living in the 19th century is because you can't deal with the 21st century, is what I would say. I would say, I got you. If you were talking about slavery, I'm with you. I got you, okay? 1865 was the beginning. I got you. A lot of work had to be done to get to 1863, 1865, and a lot of work had to be done to get from 1865 to 1964. But that was 60 years ago.
I'd like to ask you a little bit about economics, Glenn. You and I were colleagues.
Hello, Albert
some
Ma.
years ago.
Chinto Albert
Yeah.
Ma.
I can think about what you've been saying. Let's say, this is a tax, this is subsidies, and this is rationing quota. We know about all these unintended consequences, dynamic or otherwise, over time. I want to ask you about whether you have thought about some non-tradables.
Whether I thought about
Non-tradables.
non-tradable goods.
Culture. Here is a real story. It's my personal story. I live in one of the so-called West towns. You look at the high school kids, the extracurricular activities, who are playing sports? Zero Chinese. who are playing in the school bands? A lot of Chinese, a lot of Indians. Here is another example. We have, a 7-year BAMD program. This is the elite short program for training students to become MD in 7 years, cutting short by 1 year. And we attract about 800 applicants a year. And we interview about 80, and then we admit 40. And I was in one of these committees to interview these kids. I only see 3 kinds of people coming for the interviews: Chinese, Indians, and Jews. Why did that happen? You said it already. I think it's culture. I know a friend in Chinatown, and he is my barber. Even during the pandemic, he was willing to cut my hair. And he doesn't speak a lot of English. His goal in life was to get his son to have a good education. And guess what? His son got into Harvard, went to Wall Street, and came back to work in downtown. Does he know anything about discrimination? Maybe he does, but he doesn't care. His single-mindedness is to help his offspring, his children. These are non-tradables, so to speak. You cannot just pay some money and then get this culture to the disadvantaged people of color, different ethnic groups. Have you thought about how, you mentioned 50 years is a long time. Culture will take a long time to form. How would you think about transforming some cultural differences between one group to another group?
Yeah. It's a fair question to ask. I appreciate the testimony because it was reinforcing the argument that I was making about the sources of human development and the extent to which they depended upon people being embedded within networks of belief and value that are captured by the word culture. But if you're asking how do you change, and you say non-tradable, and that also reaffirms a theme of my argument here, which was that the developmental resources are not commodities. You don't just pull them off the shelf. They come attached to other people. They come within this web of connectivity, of social linkage, of social capital. But you're asking me how to change it, and this, by the way, is, I mean, it's a killer kind of question. You're a friendly questioner, but an unfriendly questioner might have said, okay, what are we supposed to do? What's the policies? You've just talked us out of being able to do any reforms. I mean, that's the most conservative speech I ever heard. And to which I don't have a good answer except to say, and I say this when I'm not talking in the public sphere, when I'm in the church basement, when I'm in the lodge, the communal space, the black space, we need to get busy raising our kids. We need to take care of our own business. We need to ask questions. We need to turn off the television. We need to get rid of that rap music. I'm not against rap music. I'm not against it, okay? But there's some of it that I think is not all that uplifting. But never mind that. Never mind that. We need to celebrate the kid that wins the spelling bee who's black every bit as much as we celebrate the kid that runs the touchdown who is black. I can talk like that. There are pastors of congregations with thousands of members who are African American around this country who talk like that. We need to marry before we have children. We need to take care of our children after we had them, whether we're married or not. We need to value things. We need to love our country. I mean, I could go on in this vein of what a mindset would be more felicitous with respect to achieving success in American society, and we need to instill it in our kids. But that's not something the government does very much of. I mean, we have education, we have curricula, we teach about various things to our kids in the schools, but it's not thick enough to really give them a sense of what a way of life is, a way of life that affords them the opportunity to take advantage of all that's available in this great country. So culture matters. You reaffirm my claim to that effect. How do you change culture? Your guess is as good as mine.
Hey, yes, thank you for your talk. I'm just thinking about one example you gave, which was, I think, the students making it to medical school or making it to undergrad with STEM as their focus.
Yeah,
switching.
It was a study at Duke.
Right, right. And so I wonder about how elite institutions sometimes reinforce negative stereotypes of, for example, black students, right? I don't know where those students came from, but say they were in an environment that really affirmed their intellect and their passions, et cetera, right? And so they make it to undergrad with STEM as their focus. Do we know, in fact, if that environment is conducive to their flourishing?
Yeah.
Often they could be discouraged for, a variety of reasons, microaggressions, but even graver instances of, neglect, for example, not having a mentor, or, So I just wonder if you're accounting for that sort of possibility.
It's a fair question. I am not. One would hope that that kind of thing, which you would expect in 1970, is not what you would get in 2020. One would hope that people don't do the microaggression thing where they only talk to the white guy who's sitting up in the front row and here, and they kind of ignore the black students, or they are in other ways indirectly signaling that we don't think you're up to it and whatnot. One would hope so. I don't know that for a fact. What I do know is that when the economist I mentioned controlled for the entry test scores of the students and then compared black and white, he found no difference in the likelihood of withdrawing from STEM. It was the disparity in persistence in STEM was fully accounted for by the differences in the entry-level test scores, which suggests to me that it was the preparation of students coming in the early years of the curriculum that was the barrier. But I can't directly address your question of what was classroom management like, what was interpersonal relations like, did African-American students feel comfortable on the campus, did they leave STEM because they felt like it was not for black people and they didn't have role models and things of that kind. I'm perfectly prepared to consider those. I happen not to know whether or not that was the case in this instance.
Hi, I want to try to comment on your question about what's going on in the classroom and on campuses with the higher than expected dropout rate, especially among African American and Hispanic students. So I teach in a STEM field at Harvard, and I see this with my own two eyes, and I also know our data, and we have the same results as Duke. I've talked to lots of my black students specifically about their choices, and I also, this is purely anecdote, notice differences in patterns of persistence between, say, white students and black students in terms of coming and bugging me about their grades, et cetera, and asking for help. White students, on average, are much more likely to come to my office hours, challenge grades, ask for help than black students. And I have a little bee in my bonnet about this because Harvard admits students who I know are less prepared to be there and then does not pair them up with a mentor. And I think if they're gonna let those students in, they have a responsibility to help them gain the skills that they need to be successful there. Otherwise, I think they're doing them a disservice. So part of the reason they're dropping out is a preparation, but even I think if you have two students on, just as an example with different preparation, the white kid is going to be the one who's going to be coming more often and asking for help. So and that is something that could be addressed once the kids are admitted into college. If they want to pursue STEM, then it's like Harvard's or whatever institution's responsibility, I think, to get them a mentor and help them gain whatever skills they need.
Thank you for that intervention.
We have time for one last question.
Thank you for your talk. I'm both sort of optimistic because you're in a space where you can speak out, but also a little worried because after we talk about the issues of affirmative action in elite institutions, which affect so tiny proportion, we're back to the deep question of cultures and behaviors. And though we like to, feel anyone can have whatever culture they want, the society rewards certain behaviors and not others, and that's the truth of it. So I wonder, your comment about behavior just took me back to Patrick Moynihan and reports there, and of course that whole report, and there's been a long sort of history of critiquing it and disdaining it, and Is it time for maybe something like that again? Is it possible that the word responsibility might be brought back into the discourse of what it means to be an American? Because it seems to me so much of our discourse in America now is about things are fixed, you know, this happened to me, fate cast me this way or that. It's certainly not the perspective that my immigrant parents had, for instance, at all. It's a sense of optimism, the sense that if you work hard, you can succeed, and also of responsibility for your own fate to some extent. That's a very broad question, but connected to the question of behavior and the sources of
And
this inequality.
while you didn't say so, I take it from your question that that's a statement we could make, regardless of the race of the person. We might worry for the future of our country, not only about racial equality. Moynihan, there's a very good book that my Brown colleague, the historian James Patterson, has written about the Moynihan Report. I think he calls it the Moynihan Report, or no, he calls it, what does he call it? Freedom, something, pardon?
There was a book called The Moynihan Report and the Politics of Controversy. I don't know if that's the one.
No, that's not the one I'm talking about. I know that's Lee Rainwater. That's if I'm not mistaken. Anyway, the late great Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan in the mid-'60s produced a government report that was leaked in which he warned that the instability in African-American family life was going to be an insurmountable barrier to the goals of the Great Society in terms of racial inclusion because the trends were going in the wrong direction. And he recommended as a policy additional federal hiring at the post office and other places where this is very patriarchal, black men could find work, and maybe that would be a boon to the stability of family life amongst African Americans. And I mean, we're not rolling back the clock on, you know, patriarchy. I'm not suggesting we go back to the 1960s, but I think there was something prescient about the observation about the significance of this area of social life for the project of racial equality. And the disparities have only increased since then, although family life has changed across the board within American society, not just amongst African Americans. But responsibility, one by one from the inside out, essays and reviews on race and responsibility in America. That was my 1995 American Book Award winning collection of essays. You don't need to persuade me about the significance of responsibility, but it's a hard sell, isn't it? For everybody.
Well, I can hardly think of a better way to have begun this series than with this lecture from Professor Loury. So let's thank him for his time with us.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Our next lecture in the series is on October 4th in School of Theology, room 325, and it will be Dr. Rishi Joshi of Bowling Green State University lecturing on the epistemic commons and the ethical duty to speak our minds.
Okay, David. I'm glad you think so. I'm happy about that.